I'm very happy to be able to give you my lecture, and I'm very sad that I couldn't be there in person and to see you all and be in the beautiful city of Krakow that I love dearly. Okay, but let's start. And please let me know if you can't hear me or if there's a problem with the slides or something like that. Okay, all right. So what I want to tell you today is a particular perspective on reinforcement learning, and it's a homeostatic perspective on how we can think about the origin of motivations and how we can incorporate that mathematically into a reinforcement learning. There's a bit of a noise somewhere. Okay, so the big questions that I wanted to ask, and I will try to get at some point, in some ways in this talk is, what is the origin of our motivation? Why do we want to do what we do, and why, and when I mean we, I don't mean just humans, but I mean also animals, and what drives our motivations, our likes, which could be the hedonic preferences, right? Our needs, and you'll see that this is what I take into account later. And also, various substances that drive our behavior, like consumption of particular goods or consumption of particular drugs, right? And so the two questions really that are associated with that is, how do we also construct our motivated behaviors? And you see, I'll guess this is through reinforcement learning, right? And how do we learn what is it that we want and what is it that we should want? Okay, and these are the questions that I hope to be able to address at least partially today. Okay, so I think when we talk about reinforcement learning, really we need to just take a small step back and to realize that really what we're talking about is a value-based perspective on motivation, right? In a such sense that our motivations are constructed based on stimuli and actions that progressively or rapidly acquire a value, right? A value could be positive, right, which would promote behavior, or it could be negative, which would promote avoidance of a particular behavior, right? And when we talk about value, standard approach to that is to say that value is acquired by stimuli and outcomes because they apport rewards, right? And therefore, sort of the economic, if you wish, the sort of the economic perspective or imperative is that we carry out motivated behaviors because they're geared to collect these rewards, okay? Right? So, this could be a baguette or a glass of wine navigating through a complex environment like Paris, okay? All right. And the major question then becomes, how do we define reward? Okay, because that, to me, is the key to understanding the origin of motivation, right? Okay, and so what would be like the formal goal for a biological reinforcement learning system once we define reward? Okay, so if you think about it, right, the way that standard reinforcement learning models, by and large, work, right? Or at least one particular way that reinforcement learning models work in applied human behavior or animal behavior, right? Is that basically it's all based on constructing a representation of the values that are usually in the cortex of the striatum, right? And constructing learning signals, right, that update the values. And those are usually, when we can think about, or historically at least, the evidence suggests that this is constructed in the dopaminergic system and signaled by phasic dopaminergic systems. So here's probably the most famous and most shown slide in systems neuroscience nowadays, I think, right? And all of the prevalent algorithms that are applied directly to try to explain the at least the behavior of dopaminergic system and construction of values in the cortex, in the brain, usually go through this reward prediction error update principle, where essentially what is constructed, the learning signal, is the difference between the expected reward, which is the value that has been already learned for a particular behavior or a particular outcome, right? And the actual reward that is collected, right? Minus also some cost term. And then this value is used to, this delta is used to update the values of particular actions, right? And so you can see that the key to this whole enterprise is understanding what the reward is, okay? And just so that, so if you think about it, right, reinforcement learning is all about learning the value of each particular behavioral choice, right? Which would be, you know, how much is it worth for me to navigate through this neighborhood in Paris and to get a baguette versus to navigate through this neighborhood of Paris and get a glass of wine, okay? All right. And so let's just kind of make sure that we're all on the same level here. And I just want to give a, you know, a 2-minute micro summary of how a standard RL algorithm would work. So let's imagine that we start in an initial state S1, so somewhere here, okay? And let's say that we have three actions that are available to us from the state. So go get the baguette, go get some wine, stay at work, okay? All right, so now what we can do is for each of these state action pairs, right, we can define a particular scalar variable we'll call a Q. So this is an example of a Q learning, right, which gives you values for state action pairs, okay? All right. And let's say that somehow we choose action A1. So let's say I decide to go seek the baguette, okay, right? That allows us, this action allows us to transfer to the next state, S2. Let's say I'm here at the boulangerie, okay? Then I can evaluate as an outcome of this state action pair, I can evaluate what is the difference between the expected reward, okay, and the received reward. Okay, here we also take into account the value of state S2, but that's a minor detail, okay? But the most important thing, it's the difference between what we actually get when I get to S2 and what I thought I was going to get, okay? All right, and then of course, the Q for the state action pair is updated by taking the previous Q plus some term that is proportional to this reward prediction, okay? Then from S2, I can go to the next state, okay? And eventually, you know, I can explore all of the potential state and action pairs that are available in my environment, and progressively, you know, that allows me to construct Qs for each one of these state action pairs, which then could be used as cached values, right, to drive my behavior. So what I'm showing you is what's called model-free Q learning algorithm. Okay, so as you see again, yeah, right, and then it says a reminder, the prevalent, at least, you know, evidence from neurobiology suggests that these deltas emanate from the ventral tegmental area and substantia nigra, so dopaminergic nuclei in the deep brain. Okay, so then again, in order to construct this system of cues that allow me to then carry out these motivated behaviors, I need to know what the states are, what the actions are, but most importantly, I need to know what the rewards are. Okay, all right. Again, to go back, the major question, what is the reward, right? And what I would like to make a proposition is that, you know, the major drive for motivated behaviors, or at least primary motivated behaviors for biological beings, should be to learn to take actions and to make action plans and structure behavior such as to at least preserve their long-term physiological integrity, right? Okay, so this is a homeostatic hypothesis for motivation, all right? This is actually quite an old idea, all right? And then the idea being that the reward could be naturally defined based on the interoceptive signals associated with the outcomes that are consumed. Okay, so this is all quite a bit abstract, but let me see if I could explain it to you better. Okay, all right. So this brings us to another whole realm of studies, and that is of homeostatic regulations. Okay, so as opposed to reinforcement learning, which is really kind of geared towards maximizing long-term rewards or returns, right? Homeostatic regulation, if you think about it, the goal is to control and minimize deviations from stable homeostatic set points, right? So, and really it's interesting because what we can see clearly is that animal behavior is variable even in a fixed external environment. As much as we try to control in our experiments, for example, the environment and let's say the imposed reward schedule for an animal, will still see individual variations in their behavior. Okay, so the idea is that these variations may come from many aspects, but one of the central causes of such variability could be actually changes in the internal state of the animal, and therefore the changes in let's say the motivational impact of the various outcomes that we construct in the experiment due to the change of the internal state, right? So all of the, if you wish, rewards always let's say not computed, but they arise in relationship to the internal state of the animal and the internal needs of the animal. Okay, and there is a whole machinery that signals peripheral internal states, physiological states, to the central nervous system through the lateral hypothalamus related circuitry, so the so-called arc axis, right, which then signals, sort of transfers, afferents the signals from various aspects of internal regulated variables to the brain. Okay, all right. So now classically, and this is actually an idea that comes from Hull, from pretty much early part of the 20th century, right, is to construct a motivational system based on these physiological drives, and the idea that the motivation comes from let's say an imperative to minimize these drives. Okay, so usually models for homeostatic regulation have come from control theory, where you have a particular set point. Let's say your temperature should be 36.6 Celsius, okay, which is compared to a particular deviation that your internal that your body undergoes. Let's say that you have been exposed to extreme cold, right? Then this compared deviation with respect to the set point is put through some kind of a motivational system, right? And the motivational system could be described mathematically as a drive function that has a minimum at the set point and increases with the deviation from the set point, okay? And therefore, based on this drive function, the homeostatic regulation system would produce a corrective response, which would, let's say, take our organism from this point to this point, okay, all right, which necessarily or hopefully would be closer to the set point, right? That corrective response would go through some physiological processes that actually absorb it, let's say digestive system like for sodium, okay, all right, produce an actual value of our internal state, and again, be compared to the set point, and then you continue this process until you actually renormalize the internal state back at the set point. Okay, all right, this is all wonderful, but the thing that these models all miss, by and large, is how do you actually know what corrective response you should take, and also how do you, the only thing that these models presuppose is that this corrective response is taken only after you experience deviation. Okay, so, but interestingly, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit of myself here, is that there's ample evidence that shows that we, living beings, and I mean not only humans, but also animals, and not only vertebrates, but also invertebrates, readily take actions that are preventive of deviations. Okay, so one of the more interesting questions also is that how do we learn to take preemptory actions that prevent deviations from homeostatic optimum and prevent particularly life-threatening deviations from homeostatic optimum? Okay, so if you think about it, right, there are sort of two critical processes, right? The reinforcement learning system that allows us to learn how to interact with the external world, right? What are the choices that are available, and which choices do we learn to make, okay, in the environment, okay? And the homeostatic regulation system that really talks about optimizing the internal world, right? It works on internal deviations, right? And producing predefined responses to these internal motivations, deviations, okay? And so if you think about it, these two regulatory systems really are complementary, right? A homeostatic system really talks about motivation, right? Motivation is defined by the need. The reinforcement learning systems really talk about learning. How do you learn what to do based on your needs or rewards, okay? The neural substrates are complementary, but they're interconnected, okay? And the behavioral adaptations that are taken by each of the systems are complementary also. The homeostatic regulation is with respect to internal states, whereas reinforcement learning is with respect to external environmental cues that signal availability or access to outcomes that then in turn would act on internal states, right? And the motivandum for the maximandum, if you will, for these two systems is also complementary, right? For reinforcement learning is reward maximization, right? And for homeostatic regulation is this minimization of deviations or drives. All right, so let's see how we can put those together. Okay, all right, so let's start. So we know, just as a reminder, we know that the lateral hypothalamic axis, that is sort of the seat of homeostatic regulation and homeostatic signaling to the central nervous system, is directly connected with the dopaminergic circuitry, and particularly with ventral tegmental area. So it would, stand to reason to propose a system that connects these two, shall we say, regulatory systems, okay? Right. So let's see how we can construct a homeostatically regulated reinforcement learning theory, okay? So let's start with the homeostasis, right? So let's imagine that we live in a two-dimensional homeostatic space. So there is glucose and temperature. Both of these really have to be very tightly controlled, okay? If your temperature deviates 2 degrees below 36 for any length of time, you're dead. Okay, if your glucose drops significantly for any time, you're pretty much close to dead, right? If it deviates too high, then you have you can get into a coma. All right, so let's propose that there is our current state of affairs, and we're deviated from some homeostatically predefined set point. Now, this could be a set point, or this could be dynamically maintained settling point, all right? Now, what we're going to construct is a function that we call the drive function, which defines the link between the internal state, okay, and the motivation for redress of the deviations from the homeostatic set point, okay? So now we're going to make a choice for this function, all right? We're going to make it have a unique minimum at the homeostatic set point. We're going to make it a purely increasing function, right? And we're going to make it an increasing function, an accelerating increasing function. If you will, this is like an energy function, okay? All right. And so then we can define, so we can write down the form for it like this. So this is a distance function or an energy functional, right? Where this is the distance between the actual state of the internal, our internal state and the homeostatic set point, okay, summed over all dimensions. So here would be 2, okay? And m and n are free parameters that actually define the shape of this function, right? If m and n are 2, then we actually have just standard Euclidean distance, right? Or an energy function, all right? Okay, so now once we define this drive function, what we can do is we can define what is a reward based on this drive function, okay? So now, what we want to do is we want to minimize this deviation, which means what we want to do is we want to define reward as a change, as an outcome of an action which changes the internal state, as a change in the drive with respect to where we start and where we end, okay? All right? So any actions that move our internal variables closer to the drive, to the set point, would produce naturally a positive R, right? Because that's a decrease in the drive. Any actions that move you away from the set point would produce a negative R, right? So pretty much for free, we can define what is, actions that would be rewarding and that would be punishing. Okay, so now we can just roll this homeostatically defined reward into our old friend, the delta, reward prediction error, okay? And then do the updating, okay? So here I give an example of Q-learning, but it could be any other, delta update rule, okay? All right. Any questions so far? All right, so I'll go on. So, but let me know if you have a question. Okay, so now we have essentially a homeostatic or reinforcement learning system, or homeostatically regulated reinforcement learning system, where we have a natural definition of reward with respect to the internal needs of the animal, right? So here would be glucose and temperature, but in principle, it could be any other regulated physiological variable, okay? All right, so let's see what we can get out of this beast, all right? Okay, so without going into all the mathematical detail, what I want to tell you is that we were able to prove that this is a normative theory, right? That we were able to prove that defending physiological stability is rational in the sense that maximizing long-term rewards is equivalent to optimally defending homeostasis, all right? So actions, policies that are learned through this HRL, right, also are policies that are optimal to maintaining physiological stabilities, okay? And then there is a bunch of properties of the framework that fall out very easily, largely due to the properties of the drive function. Okay, for example, logically, we can show that in this system, reward values increase with the dose of outcome, right? So the more you consume of the good, the more it brings you towards the towards the homeostatic set point, the larger is the reward value is defined, right? For free, we get that the value of a particularly learned action or state action pair is state dependent, meaning that the same outcome when you're deviated would be valuable, when you're not deviated would not be valuable, okay? So I'll get back to that with some examples, all right? That we find that there is an excitatory effect of deprivation level on the rewarding value of the outcome. Of course, it also makes sense that, as I told you, right, these are two related. If the more you are deviated, the hungrier you are, the more valuable and motivating is that burger to you, okay? All right. Interestingly, we get for free that irrelevant drives, meaning if you are hungry and somebody offers you, a drink, right? Then those two drives actually interact in an inhibitory manner between them. This has been observed in animal experiments, okay? We also get that naturally agents that are driven by this HRL are risk averse, as we see in human and animal experiments. And for free, we get what's called loss sensitivity, right? Which means that losing the same amount of outcome has a larger impact on behavior than gaining that amount of outcome. These two last things actually connect directly to the to Kahneman and Tversky theory, right? And they're not ad hoc in this theory. All right, sorry, I'm kind of skirting over this because I don't have time to go into the mathematics. But what I want to show you is a couple of examples of what this theory can actually bias and explain some specific experimental setups. Okay, so now, as I've told you before, it is well known that animals respond to potential deviations of their internal states with in an anticipatory manner, right? So these responses are geared to preclude perturbations in regulated variables even before those perturbations occur, because once they occur, they could be life-threatening, all right? So we know that we eat and drink, and animals eat and drink before you actually see deviations in their blood sugars, for example, levels. And it's been reported, that as humans, we eat and drink before we're actually hungry, okay, right? You see that there is an anticipatory salivation in response to food-associated stimuli. This is actually classical Pavlovian, Pavlov's dog. That's what the whole experiment was all about, right? Furthermore, we see, it's been observed that you can see insulin secretion actually prior to meal initiation. So, and the example that I want to talk about now is a classical setup for testing anticipatory responding, that is anticipatory shivering. So these experiments, there's a whole series of these experiments that were done, I think, in the 70s to test actually the idea whether these internal deviations are driven by physioadaptations or are they learned responses. Okay, so here's the experiment that was done. Okay, so it's a classical Pavlovian conditioning experiment. You have a rat, okay, you expose this rat to a conditioned stimulus, right, to a bell, okay, and then you douse the rat with cold water, okay, so, or you put it in an extremely cold environment, okay. Now, let me see, all right, so before I go there, okay, now what happens is that when your body temperature is deviated significantly below your core body temperature, right, you start to shiver, okay? This is an instinctive response, all right, okay? And what happened in the experiments is that progressively, as the rat was exposed to the CS-US association, it started to shiver, in fact, predictively or preemptively on the bell. Now, they also measured the internal temperature of the animal, and they saw that, in fact, the animal was, by shivering, raising its core temperature in an anticipation of this negative regulation. Okay, so you can set up a reinforcement learning experiment like this, right, where you have a null state, where you can sit here, do nothing, all right, that you can have a state with a CS appearing, right, and the state with the US being the internal deviation of the temperature. Okay, all right, so now you can essentially, this boils down to a homeostatic reinforcement learning agent with one dimension for the deviation, which would be the internal core temperature, right, and then our excuse me, our drive function would be just a quadratic, right, in R. So now we can simulate such a homeostatic reinforcement learning agent. Okay, so as a sanity check, you know, in our simulations, what we saw is that in the state where our simulated rat was sitting and doing nothing, of course, the no shivering behavior won over the shivering behavior. Okay, in the state where a simulated rat had their internal temperature, simulated internal temperature, deviated negatively by hand, it learned to shiver as it should, right? Okay, red is shiver, blue is not. Okay, and then what happened here when the bell rang? Okay, so what we saw is that while initially, right, our agent, our simulated rat, started to choose to not shiver, right, as the exposure to the CS-US association went on, there was a flip over, okay, and it actually learned to start shivering in an anticipation, okay, predictively to the eventual deviation, right? Why? Because the shivering acquired a value, right, predictively to counteract the deviations that would be to follow. Okay, so now if we look at the internal state of our simulated animal on the average, what we saw is that there was an initial deviation upward, okay, when it was shivering and heating itself up. There was a sort of a transient dip below, right, and then it stabilized. Okay, so our agent actually learned to predictively stabilize long-term internal state. But let's sort of see what happened locally. Okay, so what we see is that before it learned to do this preemptive deviations, right, every time, so this is the red arrows actually mark entrance into this US state. We see that when it didn't learn to predictively shiver, right, its temperature was significantly deviated below, right? Each time there was a cold shower, and then eventually it started to catch on, right? And started to, sorry, the arrow is an entrance in this state, okay? All right, it started to preemptively deviate its temperature upwards, okay? And when it learned to optimally control its long-term internal state, every time it experienced the CS, it actually deviated its temperature upwards so as to counteract the deviation, the following deviation negatively. And you can show mathematically that these deviations upward converge so as to, on the average, make the temperature deviations to be zero. Okay. All right. So we have a homeostatic reinforcement learning agent that, through Pavlovian conditioning, learn to optimally preempt life-threatening internal deviations. Okay. All right. And I'm not going to go into this, but there's some interesting experiments that were done that were built on this that also tested the effects of hypothermic effects of alcohol on body temperature, and we were able to fully account for that data. Okay, all right. So let me see if I can give you another example of how we can address not only sort of behavioral data, but actually address data about dopaminergic signaling. And how long do I have? Can somebody give me a heads up? 10-minute heads up? Okay, all right. Okay. 5 minutes?
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Okay, so no problem. I'll do it in 8 minutes. Okay, all right. So the second example is some work that we've started to do with lab of Mitch Reutemann in Chicago. And what they study is responses of animals and responses of dopaminergic system to deviating to essentially to manipulating an animal's sodium appetite. Okay, sodium is a tightly controlled substance, physiological substance. Okay, and it's a paradigmatic example of how we can study the impact of internal states on the animal's motivation. All right, so they've shown that only sodium depleted animals will actually seek and consume hypertonic sodium solutions. Okay, if you expose these animals to some other salts like potassium chloride or lithium chloride, the story becomes more complicated. All right, so let me show you some of the data and show you how our model can account for this data. Okay, all right, so what they did is they were actually able to implant a voltammetry probe in the ventral tegmental area of a rat. Okay, and they also implanted a cannula that was able to deliver sodium solutions or water to the rat directly in the mouth. Okay, and they tested dopaminergic responses to salt delivery in animals that were either depleted or repleted in sodium chloride. Right? Sodium chloride is the salt that we use for food every day. Okay. Now, what they saw is that when the animal was replete, they saw no dopaminergic responses, neither for the sodium chloride, nor for the others, nor of course for the water as a control, nor for other salts like potassium chloride, right, which sometimes is used as substitute salt, actually, for those who can't eat sodium, right, or for lithium chloride. That's another salt. Okay. Interestingly, what they saw when the animal was depleted in sodium chloride, they saw no dopamine response for potassium chloride, okay, or water, but they saw healthy, strong, phasic dopamine response to delivery of sodium chloride, okay, all right, and interestingly, lithium chloride, okay, all right. And then when they did a slightly different experiment where they gave the animal a choice to drink sodium chloride or non-sodium salt, I'm just going to summarize this data. Basically, they did not go for the, even when they're depleted, they would not go for the potassium chloride, okay, except for 1 or 2 licks. They would always go for the sodium, all right? But if they had a choice between lithium chloride and sodium chloride, they treated that as equal, all right? And the explanation that the experimentalists had for this particular sort of outcome is that the motivational impact of the salt depends not only on, of course, it depends on the need of the animal for that substance, but also it's signaled by the taste of the substance that is consumed. And there's evidence to show that, in fact, sodium chloride and lithium chloride have almost exactly the same taste. All right. So to account for this data, okay, we needed to do something to extend our homeostatic reinforcement learning model to take into account the sensory properties or the gustatory properties of the substance to be consumed, right? So what we proposed is that, in fact, the reward, as we defined it through the drive change, would be driven not by consumption, not by the actual physiological impact of the good that is being consumed, but by some variable, some sensory variable that would be an unbiased estimator of that impact. Here, it would be the taste. So this K hat is not the sort of the impact of the salt solution being consumed, but the taste of that salt solution that signals what would be the future outcome. Okay, and so now we can go and incorporate these sensory properties of food, or let's say whatever it is that you consume, right? So now we have a gustatory homeostatic reward. Okay, so here it's not the K, the actual impact on the internal state, but K hat, right? We still have our reward prediction error, just like we had before. We still have a value update like we did before. But then since the animal actually consumed the good, its internal state needs to be updated with the actual physiological impact of whatever it is that was consumed. Okay, that's all very nice, but then you can say, where does this K hat come from? How do you know? Well, we propose that, in fact, that the K hat, so the taste, could be actually learned, at least partially, by exactly the same sort of a delta rule, like you would learn the reward, the value update, where this delta is dependent on the difference between this estimated or expected internal impact of whatever it is of the outcome and the actual internal impact of the outcome, right? And then the gustatory valence, this K hat, is updated by the same sort of delta update. Okay, so now you have a gustatory homeostatic reinforcement learning system. So let's see what it can give us. Okay, all right, first of all, what we wanted to do is now do the standard RL trick, which is you optimize the free parameters of your reinforcement learning model, which would be the learning rate, right, the discounting rate, right, and in the HRL, it's also the M and N parameters, right? You optimize that to match experimental statistics of behavior in the experiments, okay? And we did that with our GHRL agent to match the preference scores for the 2 bottle tests when the animal had a choice between sodium chloride versus potassium chloride, or sodium chloride versus lithium chloride, okay? All right, and we also, at the same time, as another criteria, quantitatively matched the actual sort of simulated amounts of outcome consumed, okay? So both in the experiment and in our model, we saw that there was a significant preference away from potassium chloride and equal preference between lithium and sodium, all right, okay? And the same was for the sort of amounts consumed. Okay, so here you can see the probability of choice for drinking sodium chloride versus lithium chloride or nothing. Okay, for this experiment, you can see that the internal state of our HRL starts to go up to the set point, which is set at around 20. Okay, and you can also track the dynamics of the reward prediction error, meaning that we expect to see phasic dopamine responses, okay, from our agent, which then actually diminish as our agent starts to approach satiety, okay? So what we can do now that we've optimized our model for the behavior, we can open the box and we can look at the dopaminergic, the simulated phasic dopamine signals, which we identify with the reward prediction error. Okay, all right. And so now here again is the data from the sodium, potassium, and lithium experiment, right? In non-deviated and deviated animals, okay, all right. So this is in deviated animals, right? So you can see there is no response to the potassium chloride, and there is equal response between lithium and sodium chloride. Okay, and this is the reward prediction error response on still trials, right? After we've trained our agent to act like the animal, you can sort of see that there's no RPE for the potassium chloride, okay? And there is RPE signals for both the simulated sodium chloride and the lithium chloride, although we still have to work. This is new stuff, unpublished. We still have to work to quantitatively match the data, okay? And furthermore, they also did an experiment where they tracked the dopamine responses early in the experiment and late in the experiment. So early in the experiment, the animal is deviated, it's lacking sodium chloride, right? Wants salt, right? And towards the end of the experiment, it has already, licked enough salt so that it's starting to be deviated, right? So this is like, you sitting in a bar and wanting some salty peanuts, right? And this is you 2 hours later when you've eaten like 3 bags of salty peanuts, right? Okay, so you can see that the dopamine signals decrease as the animal allegedly neared satiation, and this is exactly what happened to our HRL agent as well. Okay, right? So by using our gustatory homeostatic reinforcement learning theory, we were able to match the behavior of the animal as it was consuming a needed good, and we were also able to show that the reward prediction errors in our algorithm were acting in a manner that is consistent with what was seen for dopamine, for phasic dopamine in the animal experiments. Okay, all right. You know what? I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the prediction, but this we were also able to make a number of predictions on the dynamics of the choices of the animal, that there should be, in fact, a crossover in the behavior when it's exposed only to lithium chloride. So the lithium chloride is a very interesting case because it has apparently exactly the same taste as sodium chloride, but it does not affect sodium balance, right? So the animal we predict should be first fooled to consume sodium chloride due to the taste, but eventually it should learn that in fact lithium chloride does not fulfill the physiological need and stop consuming it, all right? And that should actually further depress its responses to sodium chloride on the next block of trials. All right, okay, and so now I just want to stop and summarize. Okay, so what I've shown you is a glimpse at how we can extend standard reinforcement learning frameworks to take into account a homeostatic, a physiological definition of reward, okay, that allows us to construct a normative theory for intrinsic motivation and learning of such motivation. I've shown you that we can propose a gustatory version of this homeostatic RL that takes into account sensory interoceptive signaling of potential goods to be consumed, right? I've shown you how our HRL or GHRL model can account for predictive responding to stimuli that deviate the internal state. So this was shivering experiments. And I've shown you also, hopefully, that using this very simple, right, it's relatively simple setup, we can actually start accounting for and understanding how internal state of the variable would modulate its motivation, the value of the outcomes that are proposed to it, and also for the dopaminergic signaling that actually that is proposed to act either as a learning signal or an actual, approach signal. Okay, and there is it's a work in progress, and it's a theory that is being developed. There is an enormous number of questions. Every time I think of one, I think of another, right? Every time I say there's two questions that could be asked, I come up with three more, right? For example, we've only treated primary rewards. I talked about sodium, I talked about temperature, we've done studies on consumption of hyperpalatable foods. But what about non-primary rewards? What about monetary rewards? What about social rewards? Can they be thought also in these terms of some kind of a homeostatic or goal-oriented or fixed or set point-oriented reinforcement learning systems? And in fact, there is a proposal from folks at Oxford University that suggests that even monetarily driven behaviors can be thought in terms of the same system, right? And we've been also working on autonomous agents in complex environments. And I want to thank the folks who actually did the work. So Mitch, who did the experiments, Mehdi Kiramati, who worked with me and started the whole shebang. So he's now a professor at City University in London. And then Alexia and Clemens and Ted, who've done a lot of work on this sodium appetite project. Okay, and I'm ready for your questions.
Thank you so much for a great talk. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, so please email questions. You want maybe one quick question, but you should be fast.
Thank you for the lecture. My question perhaps deviates from the rationale of your research field or your expertise, but I just want to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think, so there's this ages-old question of what is qualia, whether qualia have existence in the physical representation of things, so how does it like to taste salt, for example? Like it is a very common philosophical discussion. Do you think you're actually having a good shot at describing how to physically represent the taste, the sounds, the smell of things using this homeostatic modeling?
Yeah, gosh, that's a great question. I'm sorry, who was asking this? Can you just say who you are? Okay.
Who I am? I think I'm behind the camera, so you don't see me, but I'm... Oh.
Yeah, I can see. I just want to know that.
I don't know where
it's kind of weird to answer a question from a anonymous, user. Okay. All right. Okay, so that's an excellent question, and indeed, I mean, every time I give a talk on this, I get questions like this. Okay, because it's such a fascinating area of research that it brings up, like I said, 15,000 questions all around. So now let me sort of like rapidly give you maybe two tacks of how I could approach this, and answering or not this question. Okay, the first tack is I don't know. I have to think about it. Okay, all right, but we do make a proposal that however these sensory qualities, as you say, qualia, associated with consuming something, right, are signaled in the central nervous system. It should be in such a way as to be in what I call an unbiased estimate of the actual impact of whatever that you consume on your body. Okay, right? If you look at the neural circuitry in this lateral hypothalamic associated axis, right? There is a number of neural populations that signal all kinds of things, right? There are also taste receptor neural populations, right, that impinge directly also apparently on the ventral tegmental area. So there is a rapid signaling, at least like mu opioid signaling of taste, of sweet, of salty, to the, I don't want to say dopaminergic neurons, but at least to the ventral tegmental area neurons, right? Could be dopaminergic, could be GABAergic. Okay, all right. So that's one tack. It's an open question to me, at least, because I'm not a specialist in this area. Another tack is that the lab that was doing that, our collaborators in Chicago, they've actually done control experiments. There was this thing about lithium and sodium, right? Why would lithium and sodium taste the same? How do we know, right? Otherwise we're back in the same vicious circle, right? They taste the same because the responding is equal, right? Responding is equal because they taste the same, right? It's like, what is a reward, right? Reward is what I respond for. I respond for something because it has a rewarding quality. Okay, so now they actually blocked sodium taste receptors with some substance, I don't remember what it was. And they saw that when they blocked sodium receptors, right, of course, responding for sodium went away, even in the deviated animal, right? And responding to lithium chloride went away, largely, even in the deviated animal, okay? All right, so there is at least some kind of evidence that suggests that there is a physiological basis for, signal transduction or sensory transduction related to what you might loosely call a qualia, right? Oh, so
Okay, so thank you very
sorry,
much.
long answer, short question.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
And we will email questions to you because we are short of time. And thank you so much once again.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I couldn't be here in person. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions.